The knife in Elowyn Sterling's hand moved like it had a mind of its own, slicing paper-thin ribbons of truffle over a plate of saffron risotto. Her fingers didn't shake anymore. 2 months ago, they had shaken constantly, signing hospital forms, signing death certificates, signing away the last of her savings. Now they only moved to cook. She worked inside a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a magazine, not a home. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls opened onto the Amalfi coastline, where the sea crashed hundreds of feet below a cliffside estate so private it didn't appear on any map. Copper pots hung in perfect rows. A 6-burner induction stove hummed under her hands. Everything gleamed, expensive and cold, exactly like the man who owned it. Darian Williams. Elowyn had taken the job 3 weeks ago, out of options and out of time. Her husband Renaud had died suddenly. An aneurysm, the doctors said, gone before she even got the phone call, and left her with medical bills so large the number didn't feel real anymore. $600,000, uninsured. Hers now, whether she wanted it or not. A private chef position on a secluded Italian estate, paying more in a month than she used to make in a year, had seemed like a miracle when the recruiter called. She hadn't asked too many questions. She needed the money too badly to ask questions. Tonight, she was plating the final course for 6 of Darian's private guests, men in tailored suits who spoke in low voices and never once looked at the view. She noticed things like that. She noticed everything. It was a habit from years of watching Renaud work in his studio, mixing pigments with the same obsessive precision she now brought to a sauce reduction. What Elowyn didn't notice, what she had no way of noticing, was the freight elevator disguised as a wine cellar door 3 rooms away, currently lowering a crate of restored 17th-century ledgers into a sub-basement vault. She didn't know that beneath her glass kitchen, beneath the marble floors and the infinity pool, Darian Williams ran one of the most sophisticated illegal antiquities operations in Europe. She thought she'd been hired by a wealthy shipping magnate with a taste for fine dining. She was wrong. And somewhere in the estate's private security office, Darian was watching her be wrong, on a bank of monitors that fed from 11 cameras hidden in the kitchen's light fixtures. He watched the way she tested a sauce with the back of her wrist instead of a spoon, the way she reset a crooked garnish twice before she was satisfied. Darian Williams did not usually watch his staff work. He usually didn't need to. But tonight, there was a manila folder open on the desk in front of him, and inside it was a single photograph of a man Elowyn used to be married to. Renan Sterling. The file called him something else, though. The Ghost. The name whispered in forgery circles from Geneva to Hong Kong, for a man who could recreate a Vermeer brushstroke so perfectly that even the Louvre's own conservators couldn't tell the difference. For 6 years, Renan had been Darian's best-kept secret, the artist behind half the recovered masterpieces that funded Darian's legitimate galleries and laundered his illegitimate ones. Renan had died owing Darian nothing. The debt, if anything, ran the other way. And 2 months after his death, his widow had walked straight into Darian's estate, applying for a chef's position, with no idea who she'd married or who she now worked for. Darian closed the folder slowly. He could have turned her away at the gate. He could have paid off her hospital debt anonymously and let her disappear into some quiet, unremarkable life, the way a careful man should. That would have been the smart thing, the safe thing. Instead, he'd approved her hire himself. On the monitor, Elowyn straightened, wiped her hands on her apron, and carried the final plate toward the dining room with the calm, unhurried grace of someone who had never once considered that danger might be standing 3 floors beneath her feet, wrapped in the smell of oil paint and old canvas. Darian leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the screen long after she'd walked out of frame. She had Renan's eyes. Not literally. Elowyn's were a pale storm gray, nothing like her late husband's brown. but the way she looked at things. Steady, searching, like she was memorizing every detail before she trusted it. He wondered if she had any idea what she carried inside her, passed down not by blood, but by 4 years of marriage to a man who saw the world in layers of color and light. He wondered if she knew what she was capable of. She didn't. Not yet. Darian reached for his phone and typed a short message to his head of security. Increase her clearance to level 2, effective tonight. Then he sat back, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Darian Williams allowed himself to want something he hadn't planned for. Naples smelled like lemons and diesel smoke, and LON loved it immediately. 4 days into the job, Darian's estate manager had told her she'd need fresh ingredients twice a week, real ones, not the vacuum-sealed imports most of the kitchen staff relied on, and that she'd be driven into the city for the open-air markets whenever she needed them. She hadn't expected an armed escort to come with the produce run. 2 men in dark jackets walked a careful distance behind her, close enough to reach her in seconds, far enough that most people wouldn't clock them as security. Elowen had noticed them the first day and said nothing. She'd learned, in 3 weeks at the estate, that questions rarely got answered. They just got you looked at strangely, and then quietly ignored. She moved between stalls of blood oranges and wild fennel, pressing her thumb into the skin of a tomato, holding basil up to the light to check for wilt. This part of the job, at least, felt like her old life. Ordinary, safe. Then a hand closed around her elbow and pulled her sideways into a narrow alley between 2 shuttered shop fronts. Elowen's first instinct was to scream. Her second was to recognize the man's face. Mid-40s, sun-worn, a government-issue lanyard half-tucked into his jacket pocket. He'd been outside the hospital the week Renan died. She remembered him now. He'd introduced himself back then as someone helping with the estate paperwork. She'd been too numb with grief to question it. "Mrs. Sterling," he said now, voice low and fast. "Agent Miller, International Art Crimes Task Force. We don't have much time before your friends back there notice you're gone." "Let go of me!" Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He did, immediately, holding both hands up. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to warn you." He glanced once toward the alley's mouth. "Your husband wasn't a restoration contractor, Mrs. Sterling. Renan Sterling forged 19 confirmed paintings that we know of, sold as authentic through galleries tied to Darian Williams. We've been building a case against Williams for 6 years. Your husband was the reason we never closed it. Every time we got close, evidence disappeared. Now Renan's gone, and you've taken a job cooking dinner for the man who used him." Elowen felt the ground tilt slightly beneath her. "That's not... Renan restored paintings. Old ones, damaged ones. He told me..." "He told you what kept you sleeping at night." Miller's tone wasn't cruel exactly, but it wasn't gentle either. "I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you want to hear 2 months after burying him. But I need you to understand the position you're in. Williams doesn't hire chefs. He collects people who are useful to him, and then he decides how useful they get to stay." She wanted to argue. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that Darian Williams ran shipping logistics and hosted quiet dinner parties for boring men in suits, that nothing about her last 3 weeks had felt sinister. But she thought of the basement level she'd never been allowed near, the guards who rotated through the property at odd hours, the way every staff member spoke about Darian in careful, measured sentences, like they were choosing each word around a landmine. "What do you want from me?" she said, finally. It wasn't really a question. Miller reached into his jacket and produced a small device, barely larger than a coin. "Your husband left debts, not just medical ones. We found accounts under his name we believe were used to launder money for Williams's operation. If we pursue that thread, it becomes your problem, your assets, possibly jail time depending on what a prosecutor decides you knew." He let that sit for a second. "Or you plant this inside Williams's private study, One time, we do the rest. Your husband's debts disappear from our investigation, and so do you." Elowen stared at the device like it might bite her.
"I'm not a spy," she said. "I'm a chef."
"You're a widow with $600,000 of debt, working inside a criminal enterprise you don't understand," Miller said, not unkindly. "I'm giving you a way out before you become collateral in something much bigger than a court case. Think about it. I'll find you again." He was gone before she could answer, slipping out of the alley and into the market crowd like he'd never been there at all. Elowen stood alone for a long moment, her heart hammering, the smell of lemons suddenly cloying instead of sweet. When one of her security escorts rounded the corner looking for her, she forced her face into something calm and apologetic, mumbling something about losing track of time at a spice stall. He didn't question it. Nobody ever seemed to question anything at the estate, which, she realized now with a cold, sinking feeling, was exactly the kind of place Miller had described. That night, back in her small staff quarters overlooking the sea, Elowen sat on the edge of her bed and pulled out the only photograph she still carried of Renan. The two of them at their wedding, him laughing at something just off camera, paint permanently ghosted under his fingernails, even in his good suit. Restoration work, he'd always said. Old paintings, nothing glamorous. She'd believed him completely. She'd believed him because she loved him, and because it had never once occurred to her that the gentle, careful man who used to hum while mixing pigments in their kitchen sink could be capable of anything worth hiding. Now she wasn't sure what she'd actually married, or what kind of man she was currently cooking dinner for 6 nights a week in a kitchen with glass walls and a view of nothing but ocean and secrets. She put the photograph away, turned off the light, and lay awake a long time listening to the waves hit the cliffs below, wondering which version of her life had been the lie. The alarm cut through the estate like a blade. Not the usual chime that signaled a delivery at the gate. This was a deep, pulsing klaxon that Elowen had never heard before, one that made every member of staff around her stop mid-motion and move with sudden, drilled precision. A woman from housekeeping grabbed her wrist before she could ask what was happening. "Security drill," the woman said, already pulling her toward the service corridor. "Level 2 clearance goes to the lower wing. Come on, don't stop walking." Elowen didn't know what Level 2 clearance meant, only that apparently she had it now, and that the estate had a lower wing she'd never once seen in 3 weeks of work. They moved fast through a hallway she didn't recognize, past a wine cellar door that clicked open automatically as they approached, except it wasn't a wine cellar at all. Behind it was a steel-lined stairwell descending into the cliff itself. The drill protocol swept her along with a dozen other staff members into a wide underground corridor, cool and windowless, lit by soft, recessed lighting. Doors lined either side, each marked with keypad locks. In the chaos of bodies moving toward a central assembly point, Elowen slipped sideways without meaning to, drawn by a door left slightly ajar. An oversight, probably, in the rush of the drill. She should have kept walking. Instead, she pushed it open. The room beyond took her breath away before she even understood what she was looking at. It wasn't a vault of gold or weapons, the way her imagination had half expected after Miller's warning. It was a gallery. Climate-controlled, humidity-monitored, lined with paintings under soft protective glass, portraits, landscapes, a triptych of religious scenes that looked centuries old. And standing in the center of it, alone, studying a canvas propped on an easel under a raking light, was Darian Williams. He looked up the instant she entered. Whatever expression crossed his face first, surprise, maybe something sharper, smoothed over almost immediately into something unreadable. "You're not supposed to be down here," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. "I'm sorry, the door was open, I didn't mean—" Elowen took a step back, but something on the easel caught her eye before she could retreat, and her feet stopped moving on their own. A Renaissance oil painting. A woman in profile, dressed in deep crimson, her hand resting on an open book. The brushwork was extraordinary, fine, layered, the kind of technical mastery Elowen had spent 4 years watching Renan chase in his own studio, late at night, muttering about underpainting and glaze ratios like they were sacred texts. "That's beautiful," she said quietly, before she could stop herself. Darian's eyes narrowed slightly. "It's supposed to be. It's attributed to a minor Florentine workshop, 16th century. We're verifying it before a private sale." Elowen stepped closer without asking permission, drawn the way she used to be drawn to Renan's easel, unable to help herself. She studied the fabric of the woman's sleeve, the shadow pooling along her collarbone, the fine crackle pattern across the surface that came with genuine age. Then she frowned. "That's wrong," she murmured. Darian went very still. "Excuse me?" "The shadow here," she pointed, careful not to touch the glass, to a small section along the sleeve where the crimson deepened into near black. "It's built the wrong way. Everywhere else on the canvas, the shadows are layered, red under, then a thin dark glaze on top, so the color still glows underneath. But this section was painted flat, dark straight onto the base, no glaze layer at all. It's a good match visually, almost perfect, but it's a different hand, or the same hand rushing." She tilted her head, studying it further. "Whoever restored this touched up damage right here, and they didn't match the original technique. It's subtle. You'd need raking light and a few years of watching someone paint the exact same way to catch it." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Elowen began to worry she'd said something dangerous. Darian crossed the room slowly, standing beside her, studying the exact spot she'd indicated. He said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he pulled a loupe from his jacket pocket, the kind jewelers and appraisers used, and examined the sleeve under magnification. When he lowered it, his expression had changed completely. Gone was the cool, guarded politeness he usually wore like armor. In its place was something closer to disbelief. "3 appraisers looked at this painting last month," he said slowly. 2 from Christie's, 1 flown in from the Uffizi. None of them found that. "I could be wrong," Elowen said quickly, suddenly unsure whether she'd just done something impressive or something that would get her fired. Or worse. "You're not wrong." Darian's voice had dropped, quieter now, almost to himself. "That's exactly where the restoration seam is. I know, because I commissioned it." Elowen blinked. "You commissioned a restoration on a 16th century Florentine painting?" He didn't answer that directly. Instead, he studied her with an intensity that made her want to step back, the way he might study a painting whose provenance he was suddenly, urgently reconsidering. "Who taught you to look at brushwork like that?" he asked. The question landed somewhere tender and unhealed. "My husband," she said. "He restored old paintings for a living. I used to watch him work." Something moved behind Darian's eyes. Recognition, maybe, or calculation, or grief he had no business feeling for a man he'd known far better than his widow realized. He didn't explain it. He simply nodded once, slowly, like a decision had quietly settled into place behind his composed expression. "Come with me," he said. "The drill's almost over. I'll walk you back up myself." As they climbed the stairwell together, Elowen glanced back once at the gallery door closing behind them, and for the first time since Renan's death, a small, unfamiliar thought took root in her chest. Maybe I know more than I think I do. She had no idea yet how right, or how dangerous, that thought would turn out to be. The private jet smelled like leather and cold champagne, and Elowen still hadn't gotten used to how quiet wealth could be. No announcements, no turbulence warnings, Just the low hum of engines and a cabin crew that moved like they'd been trained never to make a sound. Darian was relocating his core staff to his winter lodge in St. Moritz ahead of what everyone kept calling the auction, always in that same careful, clipped tone. Elowen hadn't asked what was being auctioned. After the gallery beneath the estate, she'd stopped expecting simple answers. She sat near the galley, running through the evening's menu on a tablet, a 6-course dinner for a dozen VIP buyers arriving the following night, when a man slid into the seat across from her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes.
Elowen, right? Eris Voss. I handle the financial side of things for Darian. He extended a hand, manicured and cool. I hear you're the one who found the flaw in the Florentine piece. News traveled fast in this world, apparently. I got lucky, she said carefully. Nobody gets lucky around Darian Williams, Eris said, still smiling. They get useful. Or they get replaced. He said it lightly, like a joke, but something in his eyes made it land differently. Anyway, just wanted to introduce myself. I'm sure we'll be seeing a lot more of each other. He returned to his seat before she could respond, and Elowen watched him go with a small, uneasy knot forming in her stomach. The same instinct that had once told her not to trust smiling used car salesmen, sharpened now by 3 weeks of learning to read the undercurrents beneath polite estate conversation. She didn't think much more of it until 2 hours later, when she went to inspect the sealed catering containers being prepped for tomorrow's VIP dinner. Food that had been packed and stored by the ground crew before departure, meant to stay untouched until she plated it fresh in St. Moritz. Something about the seals looked wrong. Elowen had packed and labeled every dish herself before boarding, a habit from years of managing her own tiny catering jobs back home, where a mislabeled ingredient could end someone's night in an emergency room. She always double-marked anything containing shellfish or tree nuts in red, a system Renan used to tease her about, calling her the world's most paranoid chef. That paranoia had kept every guest she'd ever cooked for safe. Now, 3 of her red-marked containers, the ones explicitly kept separate for guests with documented allergies, had been resealed. Not broken into carelessly. Resealed, carefully, with a slightly different tape than she'd used, in a way that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who hadn't personally packed and rechecked every single item twice, the way she always did, out of habit. Her stomach dropped as she opened the first one. Ground almonds, folded directly into a chestnut puree meant for a course specifically prepared without a single tree nut, for a Kuwaiti buyer whose file, provided to her in advance as protocol required, listed a severe nut allergy in bold red letters. If she hadn't caught it, hadn't been the kind of person who triple-checked her own careful work out of ingrained habit, that puree would have gone straight to a man's plate the following evening in front of a room full of Darian's most valuable clients. It wasn't an accident. Nobody accidentally opens a sealed, labeled container and adds a specific allergen back into a dish that had been deliberately made without it. Someone had done this on purpose, and done it well enough to almost pass as a shipping mix-up, the kind of thing that would get a chef fired on the spot and quietly escorted off an estate she'd started, despite everything, to feel oddly safe inside. Elowen thought immediately of Eris's smile. Nobody gets lucky. They get useful. Or they get replaced. She didn't confront him. She didn't tell anyone at all, not yet. Some instinct told her that accusations without proof, in a world this careful and this dangerous, could backfire on her far worse than they'd backfire on him. Instead, she quietly discarded the contaminated puree, remade it from the emergency backup stores she always packed out of habit, resealed the container herself, and rewrote the label in fresh red ink, doubling the safety markings on every single dish bound for that dinner. She worked through the rest of the flight in tense, focused silence,
checking and rechecking every seal on every container 3 times over, jaw tight, hands steady, despite the anger simmering underneath. It was well past midnight, the cabin dim and most passengers asleep, when Darian found her still in the galley, methodically re-inspecting the last of the trays. "You should be resting," he said quietly, leaning against the doorway. "Someone tampered with a dish," she said, not looking up. "Nut allergy. If I hadn't caught it, someone could have died at your dinner tomorrow night." Darian went very still, the same stillness she'd seen in the gallery, right before something in him sharpened into focus. "Show me." She did. The tape, the seal, the almonds folded seamlessly into the puree. He studied it in silence for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something low and dangerous she hadn't heard from him before.
Who had access to the catering hold before boarding?
"I don't know,"
Elowen said honestly.
"I only know it wasn't me."
Darian's jaw tightened. He didn't say a name, but something in the way his eyes flicked briefly toward the front of the cabin, toward the seat where Eris sat sleeping, entirely undisturbed, told Elowen he already had a suspicion of his own. "Thank you for catching it," he said finally, quieter now. "You didn't have to fix it quietly. Most people would have made a scene, or let it happen and blame someone else."
"I don't work that way," she said simply.
Darian studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his expression. "No," he said. "I'm starting to understand that." He left without another word, but Elowen noticed, as the cabin lights dimmed further into the night, that he took the seat directly across from Eris for the remainder of the flight, watching him, silent, the entire way to Switzerland. Street. Moritz in winter looked like something carved from glass. White peaks against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The chalet's timber beams dusted with frost, warm gold light spilling from every window. Elowen had almost let herself relax into the beauty of it, right up until the night of the banquet. The pre-auction dinner was the largest event she'd cooked since arriving at the estate. 20 of Darian's most valuable buyers, seated at a long, candlelit table beneath a vaulted wooden ceiling, each course paired meticulously with wine from a collection Darian's sommelier had spent weeks curating. Elowen's signature dish, a seared venison with juniper and dark cherry reduction, was meant to be the centerpiece of the evening, paired with a 1982 Bordeaux that Darian had specifically requested from his private cellar. She'd checked the kitchen twice before service. Everything had been perfect. It stopped being perfect the moment the sommelier uncorked the first bottle at the head table and the smell hit the room. Sharp, vinegary, unmistakably spoiled. A second bottle, poured moments later for the far end of the table, was worse. By the third ruined bottle, murmurs had started rippling down the table, buyers exchanging glances, a few reaching for their phones under the linen. "This is unacceptable," one guest said loudly, pushing his glass away. "Is this how Williams' estates are run now?" The sommelier, red-faced, turned immediately toward the kitchen doorway, where Elowen stood frozen with a tray of plated venison in her hands. "The chef requested an early decant on the reserve cases," he said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. "I assumed she knew what she was doing." The lie landed like a slap. Elowen had never touched the wine cellar. She didn't even have clearance for it. But the accusation was already moving through the room faster than she could defend herself. Guests murmuring, a security officer stepping toward her with quiet, procedural calm. The kind used right before someone was escorted out of a building. She caught Eris's eye across the room. He wasn't even trying to hide his satisfaction, standing near the bar with a glass of untouched wine, watching the scene unfold, like a man enjoying a show he'd personally directed. "I never touched the cellar," Elowen said, keeping her voice level despite the heat crawling up her neck. "I don't have access to it. Someone can check the entry logs." "The logs can say whatever someone wants them to say,"
the sommelier snapped. If the person happens to have level 2 clearance and knows the code. It was a precise, deliberate accusation, and Eowyn understood, in that instant, exactly how carefully this had been planned. Her new clearance level, her proximity to the cellar corridor, a story built just plausibly enough to end her employment in front of 20 witnesses who mattered more to Darian than she ever could. "That's enough!" Darian's voice cut through the room before the security officer reached her, low but absolute, the kind of voice that made an entire dinner party go silent at once. He rose from his seat at the head of the table and crossed the room with unhurried, deliberate steps. "Pull the cellar logs," he said, not to Eowyn, but to the security officer. "Now, in front of everyone, if that's what it takes." It took 4 minutes. 4 of the longest minutes of Eowyn's life, standing in the center of a room full of strangers who'd already half decided she was guilty. When the logs finally came back on a tablet handed silently to Darian, his face went cold in a way Eowyn hadn't seen before. Not the guarded coolness she'd grown used to, but something sharper, closer to fury held on a very short leash. "The cellar was accessed twice last night," Darian said, loud enough for the whole room. "Both times under Marcus's credentials." He looked directly at the sommelier. "Care to explain why you decanted 3 cases of my private reserve 12 hours before service, in violation of every protocol you followed for 6 years working for me?" Marcus's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, found nothing to say, and closed it again. "I was paid," he finally admitted, voice barely audible. "I didn't know it would go this far. I was just supposed to switch a few bottles." The room had gone utterly silent, every guest watching now with a different kind of attention. Darian didn't ask who had paid him. He didn't need to. His eyes moved once, briefly, to Eris, standing very still near the bar, the satisfaction gone from his face entirely. "You're finished here," Darian told Marcus quietly. "Security will see you out tonight." He turned to the room, his voice smoothing back into something warm and composed, the perfect host once more. "My apologies for the disruption. Please, continue enjoying your evening. The reserve cellar has considerably more where that came from." The dinner resumed, buyers murmuring in fascination rather than suspicion now, the drama already becoming an amusing story they'd tell at other people's parties. But Darian didn't return to his seat right away. Instead, he crossed to where Eowyn still stood, tray forgotten in her hands, and gently took it from her, setting it aside for one of the staff. "Come with me," he said quietly. He led her away from the noise, down a hallway lined with framed sketches, into a private library warmed by a low fire, the same careful, guarded space she imagined he retreated to when the version of himself the world saw became too heavy to keep wearing. "Are you all right?" he asked, once the door had closed behind them, and the sharp edges of his earlier fury had softened into something quieter. "I've been better," Eowyn admitted, sinking into the chair he gestured toward, her hands finally starting to shake now that the danger had passed. "Thank you for believing me before you even saw the logs." "I didn't need the logs to believe you," Darian said, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse skip in a way she didn't fully understand yet. "I already knew who you were, Eowyn. This proved it to everyone else." She didn't yet know how much weight sat behind that sentence, how long he'd already known exactly who she was, and how much longer he'd been planning to tell her. The fire cracked softly, throwing warm light across shelves of leather-bound books Eowyn doubted anyone actually read. Darian poured 2 glasses of something amber and handed one to her without asking if she wanted it, then sat across from her instead of behind the desk. Like tonight, he'd decided not to hide behind furniture anymore. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need you to let me finish before you say anything." Eowyn's stomach tightened. After everything tonight, the wine, the accusation, the strange weight in his voice when he'd said, "I already knew who you were." She understood. somewhere beneath the fear that whatever came next would change everything. Renan wasn't a restoration contractor, Darian said quietly. He was the best forger I've ever worked with. For 6 years, he authenticated, restored, and in some cases recreated pieces that moved through galleries I control. Here and in a dozen other cities. The money funded things you were never meant to see the underside of. The room seemed to tilt.
Elowen set her glass down, her hand not quite steady.
"Agent Miller told me,"
she said, her voice barely above a whisper.
"In Naples, I didn't want to believe him."
Something flickered across Darian's face. Surprise, maybe? That she'd already been carrying part of this alone.
"How long ago?"
"Day 4. He cornered me in the market."
She looked up, meeting his eyes properly for the first time since sitting down.
"He gave me a tracking device, told me to plant it in your study, said if I didn't, he'd go after Renan's accounts, go after me, for money I never even knew existed."
Darian was very still. "Do you have it with you?"
"No, I never used it. I couldn't."
She shook her head, frustration and grief tangled together in her throat.
"I didn't know what to believe. I still don't, fully. But I know Renan wouldn't have done any of this without a reason. And I know you've never once treated me like something to be used."
Darian exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders.
"Renan came to me 8 years ago," he said. "Broke, desperate, already sick with something the doctors back then hadn't caught yet. A heart condition, undiagnosed, that eventually needed surgeries neither of you could afford on a restoration salary. I offered him work, not out of charity, because he was the most gifted hand I'd ever seen, and I needed someone I could trust completely." He turned the glass slowly in his fingers. "He paid off those early surgeries with what he earned from me. Whatever came after, the debt you inherited, that wasn't from working for me. That was medical debt from his final illness, the one that finally caught up with him, despite everything." Elowen felt something crack open in her chest, grief and relief colliding at once.
"He never told me any of it. Not the forgery, not you, not even how sick he really was at the start."
"He was protecting you,"
Darian said simply. "The way people protect the things they love most, badly and with too many secrets." The fire popped softly between them. Elowen studied him in the low light, this man who'd spent 3 weeks being unreadable, guarded, careful, and who now sat across from her with something raw showing through the cracks in that composure.
"Why bring me here?" she asked finally. "You knew who I was before I ever applied. You approved the hire yourself. Why?"
Darian set his glass down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked almost nervous.
"Because I read your file before you ever walked through my gate," he said. "Because I knew what you'd survived, what you were carrying, and I knew, the way I know a forged brushstroke from a real one, that you had Renan's eye. Not his hands, his eye. The way you look at things, at people, and see exactly what's underneath. I wanted to see it for myself." He paused, and then I did, in that gallery, at that dinner table tonight, every single day since you arrived.
"So this was never really about hiring a chef?"
Elowen said slowly, pieces sliding into place.
"No," Darian admitted. "It started as curiosity. It became something I didn't plan for."
He held her gaze, steady, unguarded in a way that made her breath catch.
"I don't want you as staff, Elowen. I haven't wanted that for weeks. I want you as my wife. Legally, completely, with every protection my name can offer. Immunity from anything Renan's work could still be connected to. Freedom from every cent of that debt, gone by morning if you say the word. Co-director of the Art Foundation, with real authority, not a title. I'm not offering you rescue. I'm offering you a partnership because I think you're the sharpest, most honest person I've had in this house in years. And because he stopped himself, jaw tightening slightly. Because I've fallen for you. Somewhere in the last 3 weeks. And I'm too old to pretend that isn't true just because it's inconvenient. Elowen sat in stunned silence, the fire crackling, her pulse loud in her own ears. 2 months a widow. 3 weeks inside a life she still didn't fully understand. And now, a man who ran half the shadow art trade in Europe had just laid his entire fortune, his name, and, apparently, his heart, at her feet in a mountain library, with the wreckage of a sabotaged banquet still cooling 2 rooms away. "I need time," she said finally, honestly. "Not because I don't believe you, because I don't know yet who I am in all of this." Darian nodded slowly, something like relief and disappointment mixed together in his expression. "Take whatever time you need," he said. "I'm not going anywhere. And Elowen," he added as she rose to leave, "Miller isn't finished with you. Be careful. Whatever you decide about me, don't let him decide it for you." She left the library with her mind spinning faster than the fire behind her, carrying a truth heavier than any secret Renan had ever kept, and a decision she wasn't ready to make. Zurich in early spring was all glass towers and quiet money, a city that whispered instead of shouted. Elowen had come alone this time. Darian insisted she take proper security, but she'd argued that a single chef sourcing specialty pigments and rare culinary salts for an upcoming private dinner didn't need a convoy, and after San Moritz, he'd relented, on the condition she carry a phone linked directly to his line. She hadn't told him about the second thing she'd come to Zurich half expecting. Some instinct told her Miller wouldn't have gone quiet for 3 weeks without a plan. She found him waiting outside a small confectionery shop near the Bahnhofstrasse, blending into the lunch crowd with practiced ease, sipping coffee like a man who had nowhere else to be. "Mrs. Sterling." He fell into step beside her without invitation. "You've been busy. St. Moritz, Paris rumors. I hear you're settling in rather comfortably." "What do you want, Agent Miller?" "The device," he said, dropping the pleasantries immediately. "It's been 3 weeks. I gave you a simple task and a very generous deadline, and instead you've apparently made yourself indispensable to the man I'm trying to put away." He studied her carefully. "Or has Williams already gotten to you? Money does that. So does charm, from what I understand." Elowen kept walking, forcing her expression into something neutral, buying herself a few seconds to think. "I never agreed to plant anything," she said. "You threatened me into a corner and expected gratitude for it." "I offered you a way out of a debt that isn't even yours," Miller said, an edge creeping into his voice now. "Renan Sterling forged evidence, laundered money, and helped a criminal organization move stolen cultural property across 3 continents for 6 years. That's the man you're protecting." "That's not the man I knew," Elowen said quietly. "And it's not the whole truth either. I know things about Renan's work now that you clearly don't." Something flickered across Miller's face, interest, sharp and immediate. "Then help me. Give me something real, and I'll make sure none of this ever touches you. Not the debt, not Renan's record, none of it." They'd reached a narrow side street, quieter than the main avenue, and Elowen stopped walking entirely, turning to face him directly for the first time. 3 weeks ago, she would have been frightened into cooperation. 3 weeks ago, she hadn't sat across from Darian Williams in a mountain library and understood, with total clarity, exactly whose side she was choosing. She thought of Marcus, bribed into ruining a dinner and blaming her for it. She thought of Eris's smile on the plane, the almonds folded into a dish that could have finished someone. She thought of Darian pulling cellar logs in front of 20 strangers, rather than let a single accusation against her stand unchallenged. Whatever Darian Williams was, and she still didn't fully know the shape of it, he had never once treated her as something disposable. Miller had. From the very first conversation in that alley in Naples, he'd treated her as leverage.
"There's a shipment,"
Elowen said slowly, choosing every word with the same precision she used plating a dish.
"Moving through the Monaco auction in 6 weeks. Restored pieces, high value, coming out of a private atelier in Paris. If you want Williams, that's your window."
It wasn't entirely a lie. There was an atelier, there would be an auction, but the details she gave him after that, the specific transport route, the supposed decoy gallery where the real pieces would supposedly be hidden during the event, were details she invented on the spot, drawn from nothing but her growing understanding of how Darian's operation moved and, more importantly, how careful he was never to move anything the obvious way. Miller's eyes lit with the particular hunger of a man who'd been chasing a case for years and finally smelled the end of it. "You're certain?"
"I overheard it,"
Elowen said.
"I wasn't supposed to. If you use it and it traces back to me, I'll deny every word."
"It won't trace back to you," Miller said, already reaching for his phone, already half gone in his mind to whatever operation this information would trigger. "You're doing the right thing, Mrs. Sterling. Whatever Williams has told you, whatever he's offered you, men like him don't change. They collect people the way they collect paintings. Eventually, you become inventory too." Elowen said nothing to that, only watched him disappear back into the crowd with the same quiet efficiency he'd arrived with, already dialing someone, already setting a trap he believed was airtight. She stood alone on the narrow street for a long moment afterward, her pulse finally slowing, surprised at how steady her hands were. She hadn't planted the device, she hadn't handed Darian over, but she also hadn't refused Miller outright, hadn't tried to warn Darian that the task force was circling closer. She'd done something else entirely. Something that felt, standing there in the cold Zurich air, less like betrayal and more like the first real move of her own she'd made since Renan died. She'd fed the task force a story with just enough truth in it to be believed, and just enough fiction in it to send them chasing shadows in Monaco, while whatever mattered stayed exactly where it needed to be. It surprised her how easily it came. Maybe that was Renan's inheritance too. Not just the eye for a brushstroke gone wrong, but the instinct for exactly which detail to bend and which one to leave alone. She didn't call Darian that night to tell him what she'd done, not yet. Some part of her wanted to see, first, whether she'd chosen correctly, whether the man who'd offered her his name and his protection in a mountain library deserved the quiet, dangerous loyalty she'd just handed him without being asked. She caught her flight back to Paris the next morning, carrying pigments, salts, and a secret of her own for the very first time. The Parisian atelier was tucked behind an unmarked door in the 6th arrondissement, up 3 flights of narrow stairs that smelled of linseed oil and turpentine. A smell Elowen hadn't breathed in 2 months, not since she'd packed away the last of Renan's brushes into a box she still hadn't been able to open. Darian met her there himself, no security trailing behind him for once, just the two of them, and a room full of natural north light pouring through tall windows.
"This was his," Darian said, gesturing around the space.
Easels, pigment jars organized by hue, a work table scarred with years of careful use. "I kept the lease after he died. I wasn't sure why at the time." Elowen moved through the room slowly, trailing her fingers along the edge of a shelf lined with hand-ground pigments, some in jars labeled in Renan's small, careful handwriting. Cadmium red, lapis blue, imported, walnut oil, aged 4 years. She recognized the handwriting instantly, and something in her chest ached and settled at the same time. Grief finding a strange kind of home in this room full of his careful order.
"I didn't bring you here for a tour," Darian said gently, watching her.
"There's something unfinished. I want you to see it."
He led her to a covered canvas on the far easel, pulling the cloth away to reveal a half-completed portrait. A woman in 3/4 profile, the underpainting fully realized in warm ochre tones, the final glaze layers left incomplete, frozen exactly where Renan's hand had stopped working, presumably in the final weeks before his death.
He was recreating a lost portrait, Darian explained quietly.
A private commission. Something he was doing for himself, not for me. I don't know why he never finished it. Maybe he ran out of time. Maybe he was saving it. He studied Eowyn carefully. I'd like you to finish it. Eowyn stared at him. I'm not a painter, Darian. I watched him work. I'm not him. I don't think you understand what I watched you do in that gallery, Darian said. You didn't just recognize a flaw in that Florentine sleeve. You understood exactly how the layering should have worked, down to the sequence of glazes. That's not casual observation. That's technical knowledge most trained conservators spend a decade acquiring. He gestured toward the unfinished canvas. I'm not asking you to be Renan. I'm asking you to try, because I think there's something in you that's been waiting for permission. She stood in front of the canvas a long time, the north light shifting slightly as clouds moved outside.
She thought of every evening she'd spent beside Renan in their tiny apartment studio, handing him brushes, mixing colors to his exact specifications, while he talked her through the logic of it. Not because he was teaching her to paint, she'd always assumed, but because he liked the company, liked narrating his own process out loud, the way some people think better when they talk. She hadn't realized, until this exact moment, how much of it she'd absorbed without meaning to. Eowyn picked up a brush. Her first strokes were tentative, testing the paint's consistency against her memory of how Renan mixed his glazes. Thin, translucent layers of pigment suspended in oil, built up slowly rather than applied thick and fast. She found herself narrating under her breath the way he used to, half to steady her own hand, half because the words seemed to arrive from somewhere she didn't fully control anymore. Thin layer first. Let it breathe. Never rush the glaze, or it goes flat and dead. You want it to glow from underneath, like there's a candle behind the canvas. An hour passed, then 2. Darian didn't interrupt, didn't hover. He simply watched from a chair near the window, occasionally rising to refill her water glass or adjust the light. Silent witness to something that was clearly astonishing him more with every passing stroke. When Eowyn finally stepped back, her hands trembling slightly, the shadow along the woman's collarbone had deepened into exactly the kind of layered, glowing darkness she'd identified missing from the Florentine sleeve weeks earlier. The portrait wasn't finished. There were still hours, maybe days of work left. But the section she'd completed matched the rest of the canvas so seamlessly that even she had to look twice to find where Renan's hand had stopped and hers had begun.
That's not luck, Darian said quietly, coming to stand beside her, studying the seam where old work met new with open astonishment. That's not muscle memory from watching someone paint. Eowyn, that's talent. Raw, untrained, and somehow already better than his was at the same age. I didn't know I could do that, Eowyn admitted, staring at her own hands like they belonged to someone else. Neither did he, I think, Darian said, or he would have told me. Renan was good, brilliant even, but he worked from technique, from years of discipline. What you just did came from somewhere else. Instinct. The same instinct that read a wine cellar sabotage before the logs confirmed it, that reads a room before it turns dangerous. He turned to face her fully. I brought you here to test a theory. I didn't expect it to prove itself this completely. Eowyn looked at the canvas, then at him, understanding settling into her slowly, heavy and strange. She'd spent 2 months grieving a man she thought she fully knew, only to discover she'd absorbed more of him, his eye, his hand, some deeper current of his gift, than either of them had ever realized while he was alive. What happens now? She asked quietly. Darian's expression softened into something unguarded. Now you decide what you want to do with it. No pressure, no deadline. But Eowyn,
He glanced at the canvas once more, something like wonder still lingering in his voice. I don't think you're just Renan's widow anymore. I think you might be the most naturally gifted hand I've ever encountered, and I intend to make sure the world eventually gets to see it, on your terms, whenever you're ready. She didn't answer right away. She simply picked the brush back up, dipped it lightly into the glaze, and returned to the collarbone's shadow, chasing the exact glow Renan used to talk about, a candle behind the canvas. Determined, for the first time in months, to finish something entirely her own. The call came while Elowen was still in Paris, packing pigments and brushes into a case Darian had insisted she keep. Her first real toolkit, purchased the morning after the portrait without her asking for it. Darian's voice on the phone was tight in a way she hadn't heard since the wine cellar sabotage.
"There's an emergency board meeting in Geneva tomorrow morning," he said. "Eris called it. I need you there."
Me? I'm not on your board.
"You will be, if this goes the way I think it's going to."
A pause.
"Eris is making a move. I need you to be in the room when he does."
The corporate headquarters in Geneva looked nothing like the estate or the Alpine Lodge, all cold glass and steel, a legitimate front for an operation that ran far deeper than the shipping and logistics business listed on its letterhead. Elowen sat beside Darian at a long conference table the next morning, surrounded by 11 board members she'd never met, most of them men in their 50s and 60s, who eyed her with the particular skepticism reserved for outsiders suddenly given a seat at a very old table. Eris arrived last, a leather folder tucked under his arm, his usual easy smile absent entirely.
"Thank you all for coming on short notice," he began, standing rather than sitting, addressing the board directly while carefully avoiding Darian's eyes. "I wouldn't have called this meeting without cause. What I'm about to share concerns the security of everyone in this organization." He opened the folder and began distributing printed documents around the table, financial records, communication logs, a photograph of Elowen in the Zurich alley, clearly taken from a distance with a long lens. "This woman," Eris said, nodding toward Elowen without looking at her, "was photographed meeting privately with Agent Daniel Miller of the International Art Crimes Task Force 3 weeks ago. I've obtained records showing repeated contact between them. I believe Mrs. Sterling has been feeding information to federal investigators since before she ever set foot on Darian's estate, likely in exchange for immunity related to her late husband's criminal record." A ripple of tension moved around the table. Several board members exchanged glances. Darian's jaw tightened beside her, but he said nothing yet, watching the play unfold with the same coiled patience she'd seen in him before he pulled cellar logs in front of 20 strangers. "I move for her immediate removal from any position of trust within this organization,"
Eris continued,
"and a full internal investigation into how deeply this breach extends, starting, frankly, with why she's suddenly being granted board-level access after less than 2 months of employment."
Every eye in the room turned to Elowen. She'd known this moment might come, not this exact form of it, but something like it, ever since she'd fed Miller a false trail in Zurich. What Eris didn't know, couldn't know, was that the meeting he'd photographed had been Elowen protecting the very organization he now claimed she was betraying. "May I speak?" Elowen said, calm and level, rising slightly in her seat. Darian gave a small nod beside her.
"Everything in that photograph is true," Elowen said, and watched satisfaction flicker briefly across Eris's face before she continued. "Agent Miller did approach me, first in Naples and again in Zurich. He threatened me with seizure of assets and possible prosecution unless I planted a tracking device inside Darian's private study. I never did. Instead, in Zurich, I gave him a false lead about a shipment route through Monaco, information designed specifically to send his task force chasing a decoy while protecting this organization's actual interests." She looked around the table. "You're welcome to verify that with Darian directly, or wait 6 weeks and watch Miller's raid fail spectacularly in front of everyone."
The room's temperature shifted, several board members' expressions softening from suspicion into something closer to reluctant respect. Eris's satisfaction curdled visibly.
"That's a convenient story," he said, sharper now, less composed than before. "One person's word with nothing to substantiate it."
"Then let's discuss substantiation," Elowen said, and reached into her own bag, withdrawing a slim folder she'd prepared the night before, after Darian's call had warned her something was coming. "Since I began managing luxury procurement logistics for the estate and the auction events, I've had access to vendor invoices, transport contracts, and wine cellar acquisition records. The same records that helped clear my name after St. Moritz." She slid copies down the table. "Over the past 3 years, $17 million has moved through shell vendors tied to art transport insurance and private security contracts. Every one of those vendors traces back to accounts controlled by Eris Voss." Silence fell over the table like a dropped curtain.
"I only found this because I was checking catering budgets after someone tampered with allergen-labeled food on a private flight," Elowen continued, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "Once I started looking closely at procurement records for irregularities, the pattern was impossible to miss. Inflated invoices, duplicate billing across 3 different insurance carriers, money moving into accounts that don't appear anywhere in the organization's official structure." Darian finally spoke, his voice cold and final in a way Elowen had never heard directed at anyone before. "I had our internal auditor cross-check everything Elowen flagged last night. It's confirmed. Eris has been embezzling from this organization for at least 4 years, using the exact access we gave him to protect it." Eris's composure shattered completely. "This is absurd. She's manipulating the timeline. She's—" "Sit down, Eris," one of the older board members said quietly, and something in his tone made it clear the vote, if it had ever truly been in question, was already decided. Darian rose slowly, addressing the room with quiet, absolute authority. "Effective immediately, Eris Voss is removed from all financial authority within this organization, pending full legal proceedings. Security will escort him from this building today." He turned, finally, to look directly at Elowen, something fierce and proud burning behind his composed expression. "And effective immediately, Elowen Sterling will assume oversight of all procurement and asset verification, with full board confidence." Eris was led from the room minutes later, his protests fading down the hallway, leaving behind a boardroom that had just watched a widow with no formal seat at the table dismantle a 4-year embezzlement scheme in under 10 minutes. Elowen sat back down, hands finally beginning to shake now that the danger had passed, and felt Darian's hand find hers briefly beneath the table, steady, grateful, unwilling to let go for several long seconds. Monte Carlo glittered like something built entirely out of light, yachts stacked along the harbor, jewels catching candlelight in every direction, the kind of wealth that made even Darian's estate feel modest by comparison. Elowen stood in a gown the color of deep-sea glass, watching the private auction room fill with buyers, and tried not to let her nerves show. 6 weeks had passed since Zurich, 6 weeks since she'd handed Agent Miller a carefully constructed lie about a shipment route and a decoy gallery. Tonight, that lie would either hold, or everything Darian had built would come crashing down around them both. "You look like you're bracing for impact," Darian murmured beside her, adjusting his cufflink with deliberate calm that didn't quite match the tension in his jaw. "I am," Elowen admitted. "I've never watched a plan I made actually happen before. It's different than plating a dinner." "Higher stakes," Darian agreed. "Same principle. Trust the preparation." The genuine pieces, 3 restored canvases, including the Florentine portrait Elowen had helped authenticate months earlier, and the finished portrait from the Paris atelier, completed in her own hand over the past several weeks, were catalogued under discrete numbers, moving through legitimate provenance channels Darian's legal team had spent months constructing. Every document was real. Every sale would be recorded,
taxed, and defensible under scrutiny. That had been Darian's insistence from the beginning, once Elowen joined the Foundation's leadership. No more shadow trades, no more forged paperwork.
If her talent was going to build something, it would build something clean. The decoy, meanwhile, sat 40 minutes away in a rented gallery space near the Old Town, a modest exhibition of minor, unremarkable pieces, dressed up with just enough security theater to look valuable to anyone watching from a distance. Vans idling out front, uniformed guards rotating on a suspicious schedule. A shipment manifest, leaked through a channel Elowen had quietly arranged weeks earlier, listing a transfer time that lined up perfectly with tonight's real auction. At 9:47 p.m., exactly as the first genuine lot went up for bid inside the auction hall, Elowen's phone buzzed once against her wrist.
Confirmed. Task force moving on the decoy gallery. 12 agents. Miller leading.
She glanced at Darian, who caught the small shift in her expression and gave the faintest nod, understanding without needing the words. The auction continued around them, buyers raising paddles for the Florentine portrait, the price climbing steadily into 8 figures, none of them aware that 40 minutes away, an international task force was currently breaching an empty gallery full of decoy paintings and finding absolutely nothing worth seizing. Elowen watched the bidding with a strange, floating calm. This was the part Miller would never understand, that the real theft in Darian's world had stopped happening the moment she joined it. What was happening tonight wasn't a heist, it was the opposite of one. Real provenance, real buyers, real tax records, art moving legally into legitimate collections for the first time in years, precisely because Elowen had insisted on it as the price of her partnership. The portrait sold for $11 million to a private collector from Singapore.
Elowen's restored section, the collarbone shadow she'd painted herself in that Paris atelier, went completely undetected as anything but original 16th century work, exactly as Darian's authentication team had certified, exactly as it should have, because Elowen had matched Renan's technique so precisely that even trained conservators found no seam at all. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, watching the gavel fall, Elowen felt something closer to grief settling gently over the moment. A strange, quiet awareness that she'd just watched a piece of her late husband's unfinished work, completed by her own hand, sell for more money than either of them had ever imagined touching, in a life he never got to share with her. Darian seemed to sense it, his hand finding the small of her back. "Are you all right?"
"I think so," she said softly. "It's strange, grieving and being proud of something at the same time."
"That's usually how the important things feel," he said. Her phone buzzed again 40 minutes later, as the final lot was closing. A single message from an unknown number, though she recognized the cadence immediately. "You set me up. I want you to know I understand exactly what happened here, Mrs. Sterling." She didn't reply. There was nothing left to say to Agent Miller. He'd spent his entire case chasing a version of Darian's world that no longer existed, undone not by force, but by a widow who'd simply understood, better than he ever had, exactly how art actually moved through the world, when done correctly. The second piece of news arrived closer to midnight, delivered quietly by one of Darian's security detail during the closing reception. Local Monaco police, coordinating with the ongoing financial fraud investigation Darian's legal team had formally filed after the Geneva board meeting, had taken Aris Voss into custody that evening at his apartment near the harbor. The embezzlement charges finally catching up to him, just as his last desperate attempt to warn Miller about tonight's auction had failed to materialize into anything useful. He'd tried calling in a final favor, apparently, hoping to expose the transfer and take Darian down with him on his way out. But without board authority, without financial access, and with an active fraud warrant already filed against him, nobody had been left willing to listen. "It's over," Darian said quietly, finding Eowyn near the harbour-facing windows as the reception wound down, the last of the buyers drifting out into the Monaco night. Aris is finished. Miller's case just collapsed on international television, essentially, given how many reporters were staged outside that decoy gallery for nothing. And the foundation just completed its first fully legitimate multi-million-dollar sale. Eowyn looked out at the harbour, at the yachts glowing gold against black water, and felt something in her chest finally loosen after months of holding tension she hadn't fully realized she was carrying. "What happens now?" she asked, echoing the same question she'd asked him in that Paris atelier weeks earlier. Darian turned her gently to face him, the noise of the reception fading into something distant and unimportant. "Now," he said quietly, "I ask you something I've been waiting months to ask properly." 3 days later, Darian's yacht slipped out of the Nice harbour at dusk, cutting a slow, quiet path into open water until the coastline shrank to a thin gold line on the horizon. Past the last visible buoy, past any flag that could claim jurisdiction over the water beneath them, the engines eased to an idle, and the boat settled into a gentle drift beneath a sky just beginning to bruise into evening color. Eowyn stood at the railing in a pale linen dress, the wind pulling loose strands of hair across her face, watching the sun dissolve into the sea. Behind her, the yacht's rear deck had been quietly transformed. A long table set with candles that wouldn't blow out in the breeze, a string quartet tucked discreetly near the stern, a dozen of Darian's closest partners gathered in soft conversation, dressed elegantly but without the armor of formality she'd grown used to at his auctions and boardrooms. It didn't feel like a business gathering. For the first time since she'd arrived at his cliffside estate 5 months ago, it felt like something entirely personal. "You disappeared," Darian said, coming to stand beside her at the railing, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. "I wanted a minute before everyone starts watching," Eowyn admitted, accepting the glass. "It's a lot, still. All of it." "Which part?" "All of it," she repeated, laughing softly despite herself. 5 months ago, I was a widow trying to figure out how to pay a hospital bill. Now I'm standing on a yacht in international waters about to— She stopped herself, glancing sideways at him. "You never actually finished asking me, you know, in Monaco. You said you had a question, and then Eris's arrest interrupted everything and we never came back to it." Darian's mouth curved into something rare, an unguarded, genuine smile, the kind she'd only seen a handful of times, always when no one else was watching. "I was saving it," he said. "I wanted to ask you somewhere that belonged to neither of our old lives. Not the estate, not the boardroom. Somewhere that was just ours." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small velvet box, worn soft at the corners like he'd been carrying it for weeks, working up to this exact moment. "Eowyn Sterling," he said, quieter now, the noise of the gathering behind them fading into something distant. "You walked into my life as someone I thought I understood from a file, a widow, in debt, connected to a man I owed more than I ever told you. I thought I was offering you rescue. I was wrong. You've spent 5 months proving to me and to everyone who ever doubted you that you're not someone who needs rescuing at all. You caught sabotage before it hurt anyone. You saw what trained experts missed. You outmaneuvered a federal task force and dismantled a 4-year embezzlement scheme without raising your voice once. You took something unfinished and made it more beautiful than the man who started it ever could have alone." He opened the box, and the ring inside caught the last of the sunset light. "I'm not asking you to become someone's wife because you need saving. I'm asking because I don't want to build anything else in this life without you standing beside me as an equal. Marry me. Not as an employee, not as someone I'm protecting. As my wife, and as co-director of everything I've built, with your name on it as permanently as mine." Eowyn looked at him for a long moment, the wind pulling at both their clothes, the candlelit table waiting behind them, the whole strange, dangerous, extraordinary journey of the past 5 months
settling into something that finally felt like clarity instead of chaos. She thought of Renan, briefly, not with the raw grief of 2 months in, but with something gentler now. Gratitude for the man who'd loved her quietly and imperfectly, who'd left her, without meaning to, with a gift neither of them had ever known she carried. She hoped, in whatever way the dead could know anything, that he'd be glad it had found her a life instead of just a debt.
Yes,
she said, and the word came out steadier and surer than she'd expected.
Yes, I'll marry you.
The small crowd behind them erupted into applause the moment Darian slid the ring onto her finger. Glasses raised, the quartet shifting into something warmer and more celebratory. Eowyn laughed, startled by the sudden noise, by the sheer unlikely joy of the moment, and let Darian pull her into an embrace that felt nothing like the cautious, careful distance they'd kept for the first weeks of knowing each other.
Co-director,
she said against his shoulder, half teasing. You'll actually let me have real authority, not just a title?
I learned my lesson underestimating you months ago, Darian murmured. I have no intention of repeating it.
Later, as the reception settled into quiet conversation and the stars came out fully over open water, Eowyn stood again at the railing, this time with Darian's hand laced through hers, the ring catching starlight every time she moved. She thought about the woman who'd arrived at that glass-walled kitchen 5 months ago, grieving, drowning in debt, certain her life had already been decided for her by circumstances entirely out of her control. That woman hadn't known she carried an artist's eye, passed down through 4 years of quiet marriage, hadn't known she could outthink a federal agent, outmaneuver a corporate thief, or complete a masterpiece with her own steady hands. Hadn't known that the coldest, most guarded man she'd ever met would turn out to be capable of the kind of devotion most people only read about. She wasn't that woman anymore. She wasn't a grieving widow drifting through someone else's story. And she wasn't a hidden chef quietly serving a life she didn't understand. She was Eowyn Williams now, in every way that mattered. An equal partner, a discovered artist, the undisputed co-mastermind of an empire that had, against every possible odd, become entirely her own. Beyond the railing, the sea stretched dark and endless in every direction, and for the first time since Renan's death, Eowyn felt no fear at all looking into it.